It's a real pleasure to welcome to the museum Walter Hood. Walter is a very talented artist, designer, and educator. Walter's practice is quite interesting in that it combines both a tradition of installation art but also landscape design. We've been here at the museum talking a lot recently about relational aesthetics and work with community, and this is something that Walter's work has really been focused on for the past several decades. He has won an extraordinary array of honors, awards, and recognition. Among other things, has been the recipient of the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. He's had his work at the Venice Biennale. His work has been recognized by all the major professional associations in architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. He's been the recipient of the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award and has also been the recipient of Oakland, California's Walter Hood Day. Please welcome Walter Hood.
Good evening, Boston. How's everyone? It's a beautiful museum. It's my first time here, and this feels like a cage fight or something. So hopefully no one's going to jump down and start screaming at me. But it's really a pleasure always to come back to Boston, and I'd like to thank Charles and Joanne for the hospitality and some of my ex-students out there that I was able to run into earlier today. Giving talks over the last decade or so, you know, sometimes you run out of things to say. Right? And you think that Christophe Giroux, a good friend of mine, once said, you know, I'm tired of showing those same projects over and over. They're 10 years old and they look different, and I'm still showing those first day photographs. So tonight I thought I wouldn't sort of give you a canned lecture, and this is actually a new lecture. But it's something I put together to try to explain the work that we've been involved in over the last decade. And for me, through practice and education and traveling, landscape is taking on more of a sense of really thinking about culture and thinking about place, and how people make decisions when they move to a place for a particular reason, but then they forget. You know, it's like I always think about when I was in college, I would get a new apartment, and you go in and go, wow, the light's great, and then you bring all your crap in, and then after 18 months, it's like, this place is a dump, right? And then you get the truck and you move the stuff out and you go like, wow, this place is beautiful. So you kind of forget things along the way. And I was just writing a piece for a friend in Norden, the Nordic landscape and architecture, and I was reminded by some early influences of mine, Sverre Finn, a lot of the Finnish architects, as well as a lot of Nordic landscape architects who really thought about that distance out there. Right? And the kind of the landscape, and how the landscape then became a vessel for them to talk about their lives. And having spent time in Stockholm and Helsinki, you go to these places and you really understand, you know, people living in these environments, how you make architecture and landscape based on that place, and those patterns are still intact. That I can ride my bike daily, I can go walking, I can go out on the sea, but those patterns are intact. And in our case, this is San Francisco, a small garden we did in San Francisco. A lot of our patterns get interrupted. This is a small garden where my friend Mitch asked me to design a garden for him, and looking out every day, he and his wife looks out at the Bay Area, but over 20 years, all of this crap had been built in the foreground, right? The big boxes. So their view was blocked by these big boxes, and so we created this kind of proscenium that basically took that away. And it reminded me of this idea of presencing, which was first sort of recognized by the Greeks, that the boundary, you know, that it stops, that by giving space a boundary, we can actually see something. So if I make a house, I actually see the landscape differently. If I make a garden, I'm going to see the landscape different. And that these sort of nascent and latent things around us, it's all about us actually making them come forward. And so a lot of our work, particularly starting with objects, deals with this idea of how do we get people to pay attention to their surroundings through presencing something. And sometimes the object can work in a very simple way. This first project is in Philadelphia, where, you know, I was so frustrated by my client's inability to see alleys in Philadelphia, we made chairs. And we made chairs, hung lights, and then we ate. And all of a sudden we saw alleys. And again, this way of getting people to see something in a completely different way, not as an alley that had rodents, that had homeless people, but these are alleys that fed Philadelphia. They actually created the city of Philadelphia. They became the kind of the secondary infrastructure. Or Powell Street in San Francisco, where parklets have become an ideal for stopping or slowing traffic, but what we were more interested in was how do we actually talk about the city as this shining thing, but the street as a conveyor, and that people can participate with that conveyance, and that maybe we can learn something from the car. This was funded by Audi, so we basically made everything out of aluminum. So this kind of brilliance of the chassis actually becomes actually part of the street now, where the streetcar goes by, the lights, you're actually in this illuminated landscape. Or in Opa-locka, Florida, where the engineers, as well as the city officials, can't deal with rainwater for some reason, and the highest incidence of K through 5, I think their absentees is due to rain. Right? And we've been working with them to try to sort of create a different way of thinking about these wide streets. And so we painted the streets for 2 days and showed them that you could make change. And so for 9 hours in August, in the heat, we painted the street, the police closed it, and now we're beginning to sort of think about infrastructure in a different way. And this project reminded me what something called Andre said years ago when I was studying art, that a street is a piece of sculpture. Right? And if we think about the street as a separate piece, that we can move around it. And so objectifying the street for us in Opa-locka, Florida, is a way actually to empower residents. And one thing that I'm showing you here, the yellow and the red on the side are all the anomalies on the street. So sometimes the hydrant is in the middle of the sidewalk, right? I mean, it's only 48 inches wide, but from a public safety point of view, the street is awful. And so through painting, we actually were able to bring out those inconsistencies. It's interesting to see a lot of public officials out here like going, why is that hydrant there, right? And of course, again, by marking the object, they were able to see it. In Hunters Point, my friend Mildred Howard made a Rococo frame. And this is a real frame, right? And you're viewing out to the Bay Bridge. And we, in response, made a refrain to the frame. And the refrain is an image before the development came of your view back towards the bay. And what I was interested in was taking that view and through the object, getting people to kind of see the view anew. And so this is the actual size of the frame. So this actually fits inside the frame. And it was the picture that's become three-dimensional pixels that changes during the day and forces and gets people to see the light of the San Francisco Bay. Again, not about the view, but more about the changing patterns of light and the duality between something physical and something more ephemeral. Or down in Wilmington, California, where one of the largest Latin American communities reside. And as I was studying this project, where the term greaser came from, if you know the play, right? West Side Story, and there were the greasers. The greasers actually originated in Wilmington, and these were the guys who worked in the shipyards, and they would come back all greasy, and then they would go work on their cars. But little thing on the side. But this was an area that got me interested in the geology of the area, and there was a new design for a park here, a buffer park, and I realized that none of the inert material that used to exist along the California coastline, particularly in LA, exists today, which is sandstone. So if you go all the way from the port of LA all the way north, it's all been completely eradicated. And so could we bring it back? And so we brought back sandstone towers, and they dance with the giant oil derricks in the background. And the kids just saw these stones and just went nuts. It's like it was candy. And it makes you think that, again, these things around us have changed, and all of a sudden to see stone in an area at a scale where you're not used to seeing nothing but asphalt and paving changes your whole condition of where you are. Or back to Oakland, California, on 7th Street, an area that has been completely blighted, to use the freeway to actually bring back the heroes of a community. These are 5 M's, Malcolm X, Maya Angelou, Martin Luther King, and 2 anomalies, Barack Obama and a local neighbor, were put on the street because this happened in 2008. But again, forcing the landscape to rise up and deal with the infrastructure. We're down in the University of Virginia, where one of the first African-American sort of free slaves and landowners who worked for the University of Virginia, her house was actually found as the campus was moving south, and to use the shadow catcher, a play of light and shadow, to actually become a vessel for the afterlife. And here, through the sky and the ground and the burial ground as objects. They're not a landscape, they're just these two objects that have been excavated, actually now give you a different way of understanding the brick and the white neoclassical landscape. Or in New York State, 5,000 PV panels become a way for a university to actually change its ecological footprint. We won this competition, and it was very simple brief. We have 5,000 PV panels, 3 feet by 5 feet, make art out of them. You can't do much with a 3 by 5 panel. Some artists try to throw them, some try to drift them, but we won by simply saying, okay, put them in a line and let the landscape go. And at the time, unbeknownst to us, we didn't think the object would change things, but it changed their mowing regiment, right? So they stopped taking care of the lawn. It then allowed a secondary or successional landscape to emerge beneath them, and then these things started to happen, right? And then the decomposed granite, they call, well, should we weed eat it? Like, no, let it go. And then before you know it, we're Wildlife Federation. And you can go here, and there's like blackbirds, hawks, all kinds of noises in this amazing landscape that's actually working for the dormitories on this suburban campus. So again, the object has, again, gotten the university to actually see their place here in Amherst, but in turn changed the ecology of the campus. And now you can actually go on a website, and there's an app where you can actually see this landscape actually performing. And the students every May Day plant trees, use it actually as their public plaza. And this is the app that you can actually find online, UB Solar Strand. And it actually shows you birds, shows you how panels work, and it also gives you a tour, and if you want to sign up to go there and visit. Okay. So the objects are, someone was asking me earlier, which do you like better, making landscape or these objects, right? The objects are unfettered, meaning that I can make something and put it out there and people can react to it. Where making landscapes is about community. Right? I mean, you really, when you make a landscape, unlike a building, you have no idea who's going to use it, and you're going to have no idea how they're going to react to it. Right? We've made landscapes where people come out and go, why did you plant that tree? And we went, we didn't plant the tree was already there. Right? But people will come, I don't like this, I don't like red. Or I had a client who's like, I don't want anything purple. Like, okay, so how do you navigate that terrain? And again, like the object, we try to navigate the terrain through the story, through the place, and starting with the culture. This first landscape, and I'm showing only museums in this landscape. And I'm showing the museum because they're full of objects, but they almost operate in the same way that the first part of the elements I showed you operate. The first one is the Deyoung Museum. This is a view looking west towards the Pacific Ocean, probably close to the late 19th century, all sand dunes. Like New York, San Francisco grew out for development purposes. The new Deyoung Museum is a museum now 10 years old. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary. It's public, all in the front. It has 2 new public gardens that sit on a concourse that sits in a larger 1,000-acre park extent. The gardens were private donors. The museum was built by the Fine Arts Museum, which also built a parking garage. If you've ever been out here, it's a pretty extensive set of groundworks. It's a very controversial project. During the Loma Prieta earthquake, the old, I would call it more classical building faltered, and they raised over $100 million to build this new one. People didn't want anything done. They thought the park, as in a park, could not accept this. But in turn, the park can accept a lot. And as we know from Central Park, a lot of these facilities that you see in the park in 1,000 acres, they can accept museums. They've accepted racetracks. They've accepted football fields. I think Kezar Stadium was here. They've had a lot of changes over time. And it just so happened that, thank God, this museum and parking garage came here because this is one of the #1 spots that people actually visit, not to see art, but actually for casual use and leisure use, through the gardens, through the restaurant, through getting married and other things. The museum is, if you haven't seen it, it's copper on all sides. They call it the 4th facade. Everything is copper. One day it'll disappear into the landscape. Probably won't be in our time, but one day it will. It has, again, the children's garden on one side. This is all public access through. This is the front plaza that takes you inside over a parking garage. There were 15 palm trees that were given to the museum in 1890s that we took out took away, gave them nice haircuts, fed them, and brought them back. And here they are today. And they actually provide that stature. They provide the time. Many people remember these palm trees, and some of them are girdled. They're not like all really beautiful. They got like imperfections, which against this machine building is perfect. Right? The museum is perfect, and against that, the foil of the landscape sort of creates the discussion. Here we were interested in the sand dunes, but not as a metaphor particularly, but getting people to look down at the ground, getting them to look at the sky, and getting them to understand flora. And here the flora changes. And again, since there's not a lot of topsoil here, since a lot of this is sandy loam, we really thought about places where we brought in new soil and places where we kept the sand. And so you have this very interesting dialectic between the plant materials. Also, what we tried to think about were all the plants that were situated around the museum. Can we actually bring them to the museum so everyone can see the fallacy that there's no natives? And this was one of the big comments along the way. Are we going to get a native garden? Are we going to get a native garden? It's like, sure, we will. We'll get a native garden. And so we have palm trees, we have ferns, we have eucalyptus, we have every tree that was pretty much planted the late 19th century to mid-century. And that's native to the cultural landscape of California. Andy Goldsworthy along the way was excited to do a piece. He looked at our stone and was like, where did you get this stone, Walter? And I said, Marshall's in London. He's like, oh, I used to work there as a kid. So he went down to the quarry and actually started breaking stone. And he found out that the stone could break really in a straight line. So we worked together to develop the line in the landscape. I got a little story to tell you about that. So let me go back. So almost opening day, we get a call in the office from the contractor. Mr. Hood, we got a problem with the slab. Excuse me? Can you come over? There's a problem with the slab. So we go over and there's the line. And they're all with the hard hats. See that line? We're like, that's art. And then one of the curators comes out with a dust buster, to clean the line. But this is actually a curated line. And it probably gets dust busted once a day. Inside, the landscape is allowed to crescendo down, and we grab all of the storm water here, we recharge it and put it into one of the gardens. But here, the Australian tea ferns actually create the aesthetic. We had 5 different types of ferns in the courtyard because we didn't know what the microclimate was, and the baby tears were the only things to survive because of the wind changing through. The maidenhair ferns didn't like it. And again, like in a lot of landscapes, it takes a while for them to take on, and particularly in these small microclimates. But the baby tears love it. For some reason, they just keep growing, and we have to basically cut them back yearly. Then the crescendo comes out into the garden. And again, thinking about the ground, not in a formal way, but in a way that people actually start to move around and look and discover. From historical elements like the Pool of Enchantment, which we dismantled, brought back in a circle. It was once the sort of the trademark or the iconic element of the museum, and now there are frogs and all kinds of stuff in here that we couldn't put in here, but people remember that you could put, escaped Chinese turtles and stuff in here. So we have turtles who sun during the day. There are all kinds of things that have fallen in. But the most impressive part of the children's gardens are the buses come here and they just drop these kids off and they just go nuts. And then they go into the museum. But that's the perfect way that they get off all of their energy and then they can go and learn. And on the other side, the sculpture garden is much more restrained. It steps back. James Terrell took our hill and actually created a beautiful space called 3 Gems. You go in and the light just changes. You actually can touch the fog. We created a foil along the edge where we grab the Japanese tea garden and the rest of the park and bring it in. So the garden feels much larger than it is. And then through the obligatory sculpture that you have, we actually allow you to circuit all the way through. And what you're looking at is a Japanese tea garden. This view never existed because the Asian Museum sat here. So we were really worried about the changing ecology of this landscape because it had been in shadow for years, and all of a sudden it got sun. And then we were able to grab some of the maple trees here and jump them across the fence, and so now you have this amazing relationship between the two sides. But as I said, the gardens are places that people in San Francisco now, it's been a decade, It's really their gardens. And I have friends who live close by. They're like, oh, I take the kids out to the garden. They love the garden. And it made me think about, we don't have a lot of gardens in our life. We have a lot of parks, but we don't have places that are horticulturally kind of just peculiar, that come out of an idea about, aesthetics, about plant material, about culture. And I was really blown away by how this garden has become the number one place to get married because of the way the sculpture garden works. The groom can come out on one side, the bride comes out on the other. They come down and they meet at the sculpture. And it's this perfect fall with the backdrop of the Japanese tea garden. And if you want the other shot, you get the shot of the huge cantilever of the museum. And this is when you completely go to the edge between the two, the Japanese tea garden down to the three gyms. We take these camellias and put you into the slot, and you go out into the park and you find yourself down in this hole. And again, being able to take things away and give them back. Or coming around the side, the Jean Wang, looking back up to Potrero Hill. And again, the landscape coming. And for the first time, you've never seen San Francisco in the same way, because before you were seeing it through the lens of a building. Okay, moving from San Francisco now, let's go to Wyoming. This is along Highway 26. Who's been to Jackson? Anyone been to Jackson, Wyoming? Yeah. An amazing place. First time I landed there, you land in the plane. On the ground, you see buffalo. And then you see like 3 trees, and there's no more, right? And it's just hard landscape. And we started working with the Wildlife Museum that sits up on this bluff. So if you're coming from the airport going into Jackson Hole, it's that kind of orange building. It looks like a Scottish ruin, right? And it was so good at looking like a ruin, no one stopped, right? And so for years, people would just drive by. And in the summer, millions of people coming from Yellowstone. Working with the previous director, Jim, we tried to change this idea that you're coming down a road, you come up to a museum, and you could get dropped off in front of the museum, parking stretched for a quarter mile along this piece. There was over 300 cars. The spaces were 200 feet wide because they wanted campers to come. So they wanted you to come from Yellowstone in your camper, go up that hill and sit. And of course, people just kept going, right? So they put a giant elk out here. You're driving, you see the giant elk, stop the car, take the picture, get back in the car and keep going, right? So we got them actually to think about, well, let's change the whole experience. So what if you came and you couldn't get dropped off front? We pushed all the parking against the hill and we created a terrace that stretched for a quarter mile, that you wouldn't see Highway 26, you wouldn't see any of the cars. Your whole experience was about landscape because you're in Jackson and this is an amazing landscape, right? This is what it looks like before we started. There's the ruin. You could be in Scotland, right? There's the parking lot. Every summer, you have to basically replace the blacktop because it gets so hot and dry, it bubbles. So every year they were coming in and actually repaving. And there's a bugler. That's not real. Okay? And the RFQ was basically, we want a sculpture trail. And in our mind, we were going, an 8-foot sidewalk connects to the parking lot, and you got sculpture on it, right? So opening day, they sent us this. And it was peculiar that they sent me this picture. I was like, wow, they're doing yoga in the morning on this thing. And I couldn't imagine that a few years prior in the parking lot you would do this. But it's become this landscape now. This is where the entry has become an amphitheater. You can now, landscape is everything that you see. And one of the things that happens in landscapes when we get rid of scale, particularly cars, is that we see landscape. And we forget this, that the car is 10 by 20 or based on a dimension. And when you proliferate it out there, it changes how you see everything. But as soon as you remove it, you can actually see an elk down here. You can actually see small things in the landscape, marmots. You can actually see sculpture when the car goes away. But this idea, again, taking something away to get something more, the sculptural trail allowed people now to get into that landscape. There's a great Ai Weiwei show now on the terrace. These giant masks just sit up on the terrace. So the terrace is now a place that they can actually program and actually use. 26 is right there. You just barely see it. But it's also a place that brings in the landscapes and it echoes the kind of the hardness of Jackson. And I'm always telling people in Jackson, it's like you're one of the most urban communities I've ever been in. There's traffic jams in the morning. People drive big cars. They protect themselves, but they move because of this. And so giving them that back just a little bit, hopefully at least once a day or twice a week, they remember that they're in this amazing landscape. Okay, moving to an urban condition. This is the Cooper-Hewitt, located next to Central Park, next to the Engineers Gate. We had just finished a project looking at the geological context of Manhattan when we were asked to design or redesign the existing garden. And I was really curious about the extent of the schist on the island. And then through the history, really understanding this Carnegie Mansion as one of the few sort of still public gardens along Fifth Avenue, along the Museum Row, that you can actually go into this garden. And the new director, Carolyn Bowman, wants it to be 7 days a week, that you can come there in the morning, come there when the museum is not open, and it's a place you could come and sit, be heavily programmed, and actually utilize the landscape. So starting with this project, this is a National Design Museum, so it's a federal project. So we had to start with, well, what's the story here and how do we change this? And thanks for Landscape Architecture Foundation. They had already done some of the history. And they had this one drawing by Schimmerhorn of the original design. And the original design had an entry, it had a rockery, and it had a lawn, and it had a rhododale. It was a very simple estate garden. But what they had designed was completely different. So our idea was, could we take the reservoir, the park, and actually make one big landscape? So instead of separate landscapes, can we bring them in? Because Fifth Avenue at this point is really, really enmeshed between the two. So we looked at the history, and here's Schimmerhorn's plan. You can kind of see it was a complete oval. This is what was actually built. And you can kind of see it didn't really have any good bones, right? It's kind of messy. There's a little dent there, there's a little creep there, there's a little thing here. And so we said, well, what if we brought back the rockery, gave more space, new cafe, a dining terrace here, and opened up the entire side and replanted the entire piece. And Caroline said, let's give it a shot. And so looking at, the garden design, particularly from the east, we're really interested in hopefully unearthing stone, but also thinking about how people move through those landscapes. And this was the final design. So this is zoomed out. Here's the reservoir. Here's Engineers Gate, Fifth Avenue. These are new elm tree plantings that the city has just planted. And what we've tried to do is reshape the lawn, but give the focus of the rockery and the cafe this kind of new sort of treatment. The wisteria growing up the sides are very iconic, preserving those. So looking into the garden, we wanted the mansion to still have this face value when you arrived. And the rockery would be the small little blip that rose up and actually gave you, a change in space. And as we were working with the federal government, they were really excited about the possibility of returning to that original design and beginning to sort of think about how the next 100 years of the garden could be facilitated with public use. And as people fill the garden, how might they reinterpret where they were on Fifth Avenue? By bringing new tables. It is a design museum. They have beautiful furniture that's constantly changing. And so really looking at the garden as a flexible zone. And I'll have to say, this garden is pretty much a restoration. And again, I started out talking about place and culture. Sometimes you need restraint in design. Sometimes you need to respect certain things in a place. And this project for us, it was really about that kind of restraint and how much do you want to say, or how much do you have the history actually articulate what's actually there. And then, as we were finishing the design, I happened to be walking around the reservoir and I noticed that they had all of these educational or pedagogical signs out that were showing you about rhodos and the rhodo mile, the cherries, and the native herbaceous plantings. And I went, what if we brought that idea into the garden? And as soon as I did that, Charles at LAF was like, that's a good way to talk about the difference between Olmsted and the 20th century. That Olmsted would have never planted that stuff, right? But that came really after City Beautiful. And it was a way to have this dialogue between the kind of the local, but also the specimen. And so in the planting design, bringing the cherries about, bringing the rhodos over, and bringing some of the more woody plants in, hopefully they begin to collide at the scale of the park and at the scale of Fifth Avenue. We just finished the garden, and as we were going through, we had specced all of the stone, and of course we hit rock. So there was a process of hitting rock and taking the rock and sourcing the rock as we were moving through, which became really raft, some of my ex-students who were working on the project, it became really this labor of trying to get everything on the site and actually remake the site through the detritus of actually what was there. And then we were there last week for a soft opening. It's in the middle of winter, so there's not a lot of plants, but you can kind of see the bones shaping up. And looking back across to Engineers Gate, we have one tree that was like fiery red, but you can kind of see the rockery kind of spilling out. And new paving, widening the sidewalks and trying to detail, give edges, some clarity to the movement. And then at night, the lights come in. And we're using this new material, a gravel pave, which is a porous material that's recharging back into the lawn. And at night, it really shines and has this really nice aesthetic to it. And looking from the cafe, you're invited, hopefully, out once the tables are there. And then from the 5th floor bathroom is the best shot, right? Which is always a good deal, right? But this is looking back out towards Central Park. So hopefully in the spring, if you're in New York, go to the Cooper-Hewitt, and hopefully it will be in its full grandeur when you're there. The next museum, this is a very aggressive slide, is the Broad Museum in Los Angeles. Working with DSR, we were hired to reimagine this part of Grand Avenue, connecting MoMA with actually this new museum. And this piece of landscape didn't exist. This is a new residential building by Architectonica. This is actually the road that takes you into the tunnel under Grand Avenue, where all the movies are filmed. So we started out very early with going, God, we don't have landscape. So we had to actually make the landscape. It's a very simple idea. We took it pretty much like a freeway. I use this term because you get that. This freeway is a slab, and we turned it upside down. Because all the beams normally are under the side. If you turn it upside down, you get planters. It's not a great idea, but it's very simple. Engineers get it and go, we can do it, right? And on that, we then have an area to plant plants. And against the building, we wanted to create a grove. And we wanted you to be walking down the street and actually you see a grove of trees and go in. There's no orange chairs. There's nothing temporary. It's just some trees. And how do you get people to sort of understand that? And a lot of it's spatial. So Liz and I, for about a year, we were like, well, what's an interesting tree? And we must have looked at every tree possible with our clients to find something that would get you to go, I want to sit here, right? And it just wouldn't be a rain tree. It couldn't just be an oak. It had to be something really special because the building is something really special. Also, we knew on Grand Avenue we didn't have dirt because it's a tunnel. So how do we deal with that? And of course, we could lie about it, right? We could put some dirt on the ground and put a big tree in there and you would think you were walking on landscape. But we didn't really want to lie about it. So we made these bulbous things that almost were like bursting out of the concrete. And then the final connection, a new crosswalk to connect MoCA back across to the Broad. And the trees we were able to find were olive trees. And we got olives for a lot of reasons. One, for ecologically, for butterflies and things like that, also for the soil purposes, but also for their age. We found 100, I think they're 110 years old. There's a place called Ancient Oaks where we were able to go and source. This is Tim from my office who went on many trips to source these, and we were able to bring them back in. And when we arrived on the site, people loved them so much, Architectonica wanted a few. So the people next door were like, where'd you get those trees? And so now we have a great olive grove on Grand Avenue. There was an opening last month. This is looking down at the new grove, and you can kind of see the grove right here. It's just a cluster of trees, a panel of lawn, and another cluster of trees. It's a very simple landscape. And as you get closer, what you start to see is this machine building, very much like the Deyoung. The trees act as foil, in a way, a kind of a cultural foil, that there's something we're familiar with, right? You see a tree and you know what a tree is. You see a a grilled out building, you might not know what it is, but you know what that tree is, and you're sucked underneath. And there's a very interesting relationship then between the two, in the day and in the night. And we were able to then source some stumps, some brothers and sisters of these guys, and bring them along. And it's a very small little incident that you can have as you're making your way into the museum and back out. It's a very strange landscape. It's almost like the trees want to talk to you. You know, they look like big puppets. They're so sort of old. And they look like they've been there the whole time. And at night, the lights scoop around, sort of beckons. It's a beacon to bring you in. And again, just a very simple piece of lawn. The lawn is probably one of the greenest lawns I've ever done, and I don't mean green by color. A lot of the water sources, a huge sump pump in the back. We're collecting a lot of water off the grounds in the building, taking it back to the sump pump and actually recharging it back up. So even during time of drought, as a civic landscape, we think the panel, this small panel of lawn, is kind of worth it, and it's able to actually do it better than most lawns. And again, we've been getting rain lately, so I feel a lot better about it. But when you look down closely at the details are very simple. Daimania against something very hardy against a decomposed granite. Very simple landscape. And then our little bulges are out here, which the skateboarders love, and people are stealing the plants. So it's a good thing when people take plants. That means they're interested. We just have to keep paying for them, right? Right on time. I wanted to end with this project, the International African American Museum. Will be built in Charleston, South Carolina. And I know there's a lot of attention given to the National Museum in Washington, D.C. that's being built. But Mayor Riley out of Charleston, South Carolina, he didn't run for mayor again. So he's finishing his career, I think, after 40 years. For those of you who don't know Mayor Riley, he's probably the greatest friend to design as a mayor. He's helped develop the Mayor's Institute, but he's been a staunch advocate for good design, starting in Charleston, but actually bringing all the other mayors of the United States together. This project for him is a very important project. And one of the things, this will be a center where people can actually go and actually find your history. So it's not a touchstone. It won't have everything African American. Hopefully there won't be Willie Mays' jersey and all that stuff here. This is a real place, a place where you'll go to, and you'll either to seek out community or to learn something about South Carolina and learn something about this place. When I first heard about the project, the site was located somewhere here. And they went through a design process and nothing really happened. They had a different architect. About a year ago, I got a call from Harry Cobb of Pay Cobb Freed, and Harry said, "Walter, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Working." He goes, "I need you to come to Charleston. We are building a museum." I got to do it the way Harry would do it. "We're building a museum, and it's about landscape, architecture, and structure." And to this day, we've been working for over a year. Harry has not wavered in the claim that the building and the landscape are something that live together. And the reason why he felt so strongly about it, the site that we actually have is a real living site. And what I mean by that is, like all the other projects that I've shown you today, we've talked about the past as well as the present as well as the future. And here, for this museum to actually be on hallowed ground. Gadsden's Wharf was one of the largest wharfs in America. It was over 300 feet long, over 100 feet wide. It had storage capacity, and this is over a 10-year period. They think more than half, 50% of all African Americans' lineage is traced back to this space. So this is Plymouth Rock for a lot of African Americans. So it's actually a real place. It has a real story to it. This was the edge. Sullivan's Island is out here. Slaves were kept out on Sullivan's Island, quarantined until they were deemed healthy, then brought here to Gadsden's Wharf. sold, and then stored. And there are some pretty powerful accounts of the storage, to the point where a lot of slaves were actually, their bodies were actually just left to be eaten by buzzards or thrown into the river or the bay. And I was there a couple of weeks ago, and one of the artists said something that really changed how I look at the aquarium, which is really next door, is that there were so many bodies dumped in the harbor, in the river, that it actually changed the shark feeding cycle. That there were more sharks then coming closer to the edge because they were coming for food. But this was a period of time, again, where we don't really talk about, haven't reconciled this part of our history. And so this project will actually be in Charleston, and it will hopefully house that memory, but also the reconciliation. It should be a landscape where people come to and have to confront, right? Confront our past. And this is, I think, a lot of scholars, a lot of people are talking about this today in the wake of a lot of events that we're having in this country. And one of the events were in the African AME Church, which is 2 blocks from here. So that happened in a very close quarters. Here's the site. Again, we're sandwiched in between a high-rise and a small aquatic center. It's about 95,000 square feet. The building sits above the water as a long slot. It's about 13 feet underneath. One side, you can view the city. The other side, you view back to Africa. It's a very simple design. It's a tripartite scheme. Very much like the houses in Charleston, the landscape occupies the south side. So it's like a piazza. So this is a very simple pattern that you see. There will be a family history center on one end and Atlantic Connections on the other end, and a central core. We started the project really thinking about how do we take landscape and how can landscape actually speak to all of these things, right? I mean, the building was pretty much pre-designed because it knew it had this duality, but it had to sit up. But the landscape, we're challenged with how do we tell this story, but tell it in a very powerful way. And so we looked at a lot of things. We looked at a lot of things that are African, but we also looked at a lot of things that were American. And what we ended up coming to was that this should be a landscape that was constantly changing. And this is early kind of matrix. The way we work is like, 20 different designs that deal with different things, from cultural patterns to being able to take the dock to Sullivan's Islands, to really thinking about the wharf, thinking about African connections, but more importantly, thinking about the water's edge. And the biggest problem that we had was in the beginning, we're up 8 feet off of the water because of the tide. And so you can't get to the water's edge. And so how do you celebrate something that you can't get to? And plus, from an archaeological point of view, it's moved. So once we've exhausted all of our sort of pieces, we came to a very simple landscape. Under the building would be a sheltered space that would talk about ground and talk about the memorial. To one side would be a hush harbor. And I remembered a lecture years ago in one of my cultural landscape classes that talked about the hush harbors were a place where slaves could actually go in and take retreat against their plantation owners, but it's where the first black church started. It's where your burials could take place. And it turns out, again, with the research here, we know that a lot of the slaves, when they first came to America, they had already had religion. Some were Islamic and others were Christian. And that's something that's not told. And that's one of the reasons why they think in the Low Country, the Gullah culture was able to stay intact, because it already had faith. And they were able then to take that faith and use that to make a landscape. Inside, that view out to Sullivan's will be unfettered. Underneath, taking tabby, which is a local material of shales, and making the ground, but the columns come up and become part of that ground. So the building feels really heavy. The core, though, will be light and really spiritual, taking you up. And as you go up, again, dealing with memory and reconciliation, the monument underneath that takes you up to reconcile that when you're up looking out over the horizon. And then the line comes back, again, Gadsden's Wharf, and again, really thinking about how that might manifest. And for us in the landscape, we've just always cut the sections horizontally because the water, the horizons were always the things that we were really thinking about. So as you're moving through, that horizon is always there with you. And as you cut the building, you can see the Hush Harbor. We decided to raise the ground so you actually feel like you're walking a marsh, right? So the grasses are up here and you actually feel it. Or as you're going closer, we're catching water and there's great rainstorms here. So imagine a 15-minute event, all of this will recharge and you'll actually have a swamp, right? And you can actually come out over that swamp. Oak trees, palm trees, cypress trees create the landscape. A landscape of wanting, a landscape of being. Being in the monument, you'll actually be at the grade of the wharf itself. So you can imagine being at that same level, that slaves were at the same level. And you're able then to have that moment before you rise up. And when you rise up out of that, hopefully that landscape will be this place that teaches you and allows you to sort of live out the daily patterns. And this, unlike a lot of sacred places, will be a 24-hour landscape. You'll actually be able to walk through here any hour of day. And people do that in Charleston. You see people at night, 1 o'clock, looking at mansions. So you can imagine people walking around and discovering this place. Discovering maybe through some of the life ways, the things that will happen, through the gardens, through the flora, through the fauna, but also through being embedded in a landscape. Right? A landscape that seems really claustrophobic at times, but then open on other times. A landscape that looks out to the horizon, but also connects you back to the building. And I was talking about the water. Harry and I finally came to a moment where we were like, this is the only way to do this. And it's a kind of a strange idea to take water and put water up on the promenade. So you're basically sitting above the water to keep the water at bay. We're actually creating an infinity fountain along the actual boardwalk. So imagine you're out walking Charleston with the kids and you're going to be confronted by water. And for me, that's a moment where I'm hoping people will be moved by that moment. You'll be maybe moved to take your shoes off. As I was talking to one local neighbor, she was like, I'm going to dance. But this notion that I'm hoping different cultural patterns and practices manifest through an experience and that people don't feel reserved to be standardized and normal, looking at the next person, but really having their emotions kind of play out within this space. And water is one of these things, particularly in Charleston, that has always been part of people's lives and that they've tried to keep away. But when you go up the Ashley, you really see that through Carolina Gold, through that cultivation of rice, Charleston wouldn't be the place it was. It wouldn't have had the first opera house. It wouldn't have had some of the first schools. It was the richest city in the country because of this economic sort of fortune at the time. As you come out of the museum, you'll come on a bridge and you'll actually come through the treetops of the oak trees that will bring you back down to the ground. And then coming back around, you'll be focused back on the sacred place. And hopefully over time, the sacredness will sort of unfold into a set of rituals and patterns and a place for families like myself to go there and actually learn about my lineage. Thank you guys so much for being so attentive. Questions? Okay. Have a good evening. I'm so sorry.
Well, I was just thinking about the cars and how you transformed that and brought that landscape out so amazingly by getting our eyes off the cars. And I don't need to be touching any sensitivity here, but when I went to the Clark Museum out in Williamstown, which I really enjoyed, have you been there yet?
I know it.
Well, it's a wonderful building, but my first impression got drawn over to this parking lot, and I just thought, what? And it's a beautiful setting, and I just yearned for some way to hide those cars, whether it was plantings or just get a mound of earth going up in there. Just an observation, but it was.
Thank you. That's a good observation. No, I mean the automobile is. I think we're on the backside. I probably won't live to kind of see it, but again, the point I was trying to make with the object is. They have a way of shaping how we see the world, you know, and I just remember very early reading Dissotto and some of the other French postmodern theorists and being fascinated, well, why are they talking about possession? You know, I just remember reading something about possessing a chair, right? That you're sitting in it and you're possessing a chair, but when you're out of it, you see that thing, we still possess it. We still see it as a chair, which means that it's clouding the way you see everything else. And the beautiful thing about some things, if we can get into this sort of transformational sort of way of thinking about, okay, when it's not in use, it's something else, right? And again, we're beginning to kind of see that with a lot of urban projects, urbanism projects, but I think it has to become more of an ethic as a designer, that you're constantly, you can't have a single use thing like a parking lot anymore. You know, it just doesn't work. So. Any others? Yes, ma'am. The question was, she doesn't do what we do, or some of us do, and there must be engineers and other people that help us do what we do. Every project I've shown here, there's probably 20 people associated with it, not in my firm, in other allied professions. For us, we start every project with the engineers, and we use Arup engineering. We have actually, somehow, we have a contract that we can actually call them. They're like huge international company. But we started working with them about 15 years ago, and some of the principals were like, oh, we like what you do, so anytime you need us, call us. And we took them up on it. But the interesting thing about it is, every project we start, we don't know what engineers we need. So they will send you, like they'll say, how many people do you want? I can afford 4. They'll send you a facades guy, they might send you a plumber, they might send you a mechanical engineer. They might not even send a civil engineer, and we're doing a project, which is, you never would think that. But what happens is, these other engineers have a different view of the thing you've been doing over and over, and that's how you're able then to change the way you think about it. And then the civils come in, the others come in, but in the beginning, it's more of a think tank. And a lot of the projects start that way, and we've been fortunate to work with them, and I always look forward to projects that I know they want to work on. Like we just got a project I call, it's like, we're doing the bio line, and they were like, oh, wow, cool, we're going to send over the facades guy, not the facades guy, okay? But they are just, I mean, every project has a slew of experts that we work with. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about your choice of trees at the Charleston project and the oaks seem really familiar, but I don't know whether palms are familiar there or feels like it's a way different. It's a very interesting choice.
Yeah, the cypress and the oaks are local low country. The cypress love to be wet. The oaks love to be semi-wet. The palms are, it's interesting you bring that up, you noted it, because most of the time when you're in Charleston you see the palmettos, and I hate them. Because they're like, I don't know, it's just not interesting. I mean, they're flat, they don't have a nice canopy. And we were talking with possibly getting something taller that had a more West African connection. And the taller palms, which have not been decided species, is a way for us to sort of find something that's not of Charleston. And we know we're like right on the edge climatically, so we're still trying to source the right one, but that's the basic idea. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question. So I'm not an architect and not a landscape architect. I'm not a urban planner. However, always been fascinated with it. So I go to talk like this. And but I am concerned about the environment and living on the coast. This coast, there's certainly a lot of planning by Boston and I imagine other cities to address climate change and the effects of that.
Well, I think for a lot of cities now, resilient planning is at the top of the list. And I know Boston, it's up there. And what I mean by resilient planning, I mean we're looking at possibly a change of, you know, a meter in sea level rise, which is going to inundate a lot of places. So I know Boston is definitely looking at that. New York is looking at it. Right now, there's over $100 million in grant money being given out to coastal cities now. There's a big competition. We're on a team with New Orleans, but a lot of the coastal cities are vying for that money. They already have projects in place meaning that they can actually start to think about that. So it is a big issue, but I think the bigger issue, along with resilient planning, is we can't protect ourselves. And we still have this ethic is that we can hold it back. That ethic still prevails. And I don't know, I think it's going to have to happen culturally. I don't think it's going to happen from the politicians. I think it's going to happen from the citizens. It's got to happen in a completely different way because, I mean, when you think about it, I live in California, and before we had the drought, you know, every year the Napa River flooded. The same people got interviewed, same people wanted to build back, right? And so this is an ethic that we can do it. And until that changes, we'll still have issues in the South, issues in the Northeast, issues in the West. But I think what you're beginning to see in the professions, though, in architecture, urbanism, is that we're out in front really trying to articulate, you know, this idea of resilience. And it doesn't just mean to let things go, right? It means that there has to be this happy sort of median, you know, and I think some places we have to let go, and some places I think we can actually cultivate a way to live there. So it's something ongoing that the next generation of designers are definitely going to deal with. So it's a great question. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
Question about the olive trees. Are they still producing olives, and do you have an issue with?
They're non-olive producing, and again, these were grafted and grown. This nursery has almost any type of olive you need, but there's a huge culture of grafting olives and vineyards for vimetry. I can't pronounce the word. So that you can actually find 100-year-old stock for grapes and for olives, particularly from Spain in that area. So, okay. Thank you guys so much. Have a nice evening.